So, Christopher Nolan's Odyssey trailer was released last month, and oh my goodness, was the discourse divisive, to say the least. It seems like we have one of two camps. You have one being disappointed in the trailer, pointing out glaringly grating visual choices in the trailer, from Batman-looking armour to a Viking ship, and those thinking they're incredibly intelligent by stating the obvious in response, going, it's fictional, bro, it's not real, it's based on a myth, there's no such thing as historical accuracy. Now, as someone who has defended the choice of anachronistic artistic license in creatives, very recently, in fact, in my Wuthering Heights video, and who has defended some people's decisions to not be historically accurate in film and television, because I don't expect entertainers or people who work in the entertainment industry to be educators, or even educated on the subject they're telling, because, believe it or not, one, I have very little faith in humanity, and two, I know that's not what they're being paid millions of dollars for on exceptionally tight deadlines. That being said, I'm going to talk about why Nolan's trailer didn't fill me with the joy that I hoped it would have, and I'm also going to explain why the argument there should be no historical accuracy because it's based on fiction sounds like a sensible argument, but in reality is actually a terribly weak argument. And to frame my whole argument in this discussion, I'm going to use my favourite film franchise of all time, The Lord of the Rings. Yes, people weren't expecting me to talk about The Lord of the Rings, but I will talk about The Lord of the Rings. And The Lord of the Rings needs no introduction. It's a fantasy film series based on the high fantasy books of J.R.R. Tolkien, and as to be expected, it has many magical elements within it. We have elves and hobbits, dragons, ents, dwarves, wizards, orcs, basically everything. Now, the world of J.R.R. Tolkien is entirely fantastical, and yet Peter Jackson's films feel rather realistic. And that's because even though everything in the films is extraordinary to us, nothing looks out of place in this world. There is a consistent theme running throughout the films. Like many high fantasy stories, The Lord of the Rings creates this pseudo-medieval world, one that is medieval looking and functioning in many ways, but bolstered by magic. So the clothing, notably, is medieval inspired. The colours focus on earthy tones, but they stick to natural fabrics like wool and linen and silk, along with the fashion such as like layered tunics, cloaks, and simple leather accessories. Even though they have leather, no one is wearing a black leather jacket or white trainers, or no one has a low taper fade. You get the gist. Unless you look at the more recent renditions of Lord of the Rings. We're ignoring them. Anyway, similarly, many of the tools in the film, manufacturing processes, the modes of transport, are reminiscent of the medieval period, but they are not historically accurate to the medieval period, because we see things like fireworks and clocks, which weren't invented until much later. That being said, the advanced technology in this world is still reminiscent of an old world in a way. They're not jarring to see within Middle-earth, as perhaps rifles and guns may have looked, because clocks and fireworks echo elements of the aestheticism of the world that they're part of. They're magical, they're rather whimsical, they're old school, academic, and rather simplistic. So everything in the Lord of the Rings films looks like it was produced organically within this fantastical world. And even though Peter Jackson and technically J.R.R. Tolkien could have brought in any visuals they wanted to, because they are working within a magical fantasy world and anything could possibly exist within that construct, they don't. Because to make something more immersive, there has to be limitations, otherwise there are no stakes, and that includes the aesthetics of the world that these magical creatures inhabit. Now, you know where I'm going with this, but before we talk about the massive elephant in the room, I need to draw attention to a major talking point in this discussion. You see, those who claim the Odyssey is a work of fiction and therefore is not bound by the constraints of historical reality are inaccurately conflating the Odyssey with Lord of the Rings. You see, Lord of the Rings is a fantasy, but the Odyssey isn't a fantasy. The Odyssey is mythology, and those are two very different things, otherwise they wouldn't have two distinctive terms for them, and as such, different rules apply. Now, Joshua Mark in the World History Encyclopedia explains mythology rather well, so I'm going to use his verbiage. You see, the word mythology comes from the Greek word mythos, the story of the people, and logos, the word for speech. So in all, it means a spoken story of a people. Mythology is the study and interpretation of often sacred tales or fables of a culture, which deal with various aspects of the human condition: good and evil, the meaning of suffering, human origins, the origins of place names, animals, cultural values and traditions, and the meaning of life and death, the afterlife, celestial stories of the gods or a singular god. Myths thus express the beliefs and values of these subjects held by a certain culture. In other words, a myth is not a fantasy. It is rooted in reality, and the supernatural elements of them are merely placeholders explaining how reality is shaped by the real peoples who told these stories, who did not have the archaeological or scientific understanding of the world we have today. Therefore, to ignore the real significance of the Bronze Age, the Bronze Aged peoples of the Odyssey, their mechanical, scientific and aesthetic realities, their beliefs, their modes of transport, the limitations of their industry and production processes, how they looked, how they dressed, or how they fought, is to ignore the Odyssey entirely, and to erase its historical and cultural significance for the benefit of oneself at a disservice to a text to which we owe centuries of culture and literature. So, with all that said, and with all due respect, what the fuck is this? What material is this made of in Bronze Age Greece? Honestly, it looks just like leftover material from the Batman films, which was far too expensive to justify discarding, but could have easily been handed over to the Marvel Studios for their latest Black Panther film as a charitable gesture, and no one would have been the wiser. And I know many people think it looks cool, but honestly to me it just looks like those garish barbershops that are all over the UK, and they have black walls and gold sinks. And unlike the costumes of Lord of the Rings, which is a fantasy film, this costume doesn't look organic to the world it's part of. You know, had it been like really dark bronzed armour with a real spine, you know, running down the back, that would have been cool. Now obviously we're only talking about a trailer, we don't know what's actually happening. Any assumptions that I make in this video could be entirely explained away in the larger context of the film. So perhaps his armour is divine armour, which is why it's made of some obscure material, and why it's pristine, and why it has Chad cheekbones carved into the helmet that makes it look like handsome Squidward is cosplaying Greek Batman. And obviously we have the plumed helmets here, which is far from the Bronze Age armour or the boar tusk helmet Odysseus famously wears, but I sort of accept that Hollywood loves a plumed helmet, and they always pick it for aesthetic reasons, even though I still think Bronze Age armour could have looked really cool if there was just a single director out there brave enough to make that leap. And I never thought I'd be defending the choices of the Troy film, which I discussed at length in a Patreon video a few years ago, but I actually prefer the armour designs in that film, despite them also being historically inaccurate, because they look handmade. They look like they are organic to the world in which they exist, whilst also attending to Hollywood aesthetic needs. And to be honest, this Batman armour, even if it turns out to be divine armour, sort of just suggests that the gods have a sweatshop in Olympus churning out cheap plastic Marvel costumes, in all honesty. Now, speaking of looking organic to the world in which they exist, let's talk about the least looking Mediterranean cast choices I've ever seen. Now, obviously, this completely excludes all actors playing gods, because they're gods. They can look however they please, and they can take any form, and honestly, if I were Athena, I sure as hell would choose to look like Zendaya. But for the main cast, particularly the main trio, whilst they're all brilliant actors, I'm sure, they sort of personify the issues that we have with the British Museum and their Elgin marbles rather than the Parthenon marbles. They sort of look like sterilised versions and look very out of place. I mean, Odysseus does not look like a man who has been exposed to the Mediterranean climate in a war for 10 years, followed by 3 years at sea under the same climate, followed by 7 years stranded on a Mediterranean island. And likewise, Penelope and Telemachus don't look like they remotely belong there. Like, when did they last see the sun? It's not like it's Victorian England where people hide away to keep their skin pale. Ironically, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, a video game, does a much better job at showcasing authentic-looking Greek people than this film. At least they look like they have been in the sun. And honestly, it would have been nice to have some Greek or Mediterranean actors in this film. It's not like Nolan needs big cast names to pull people in to see any film of his. Like, he is the name of itself. And once again, these main characters exempt from the gods and the mythological creatures, they're not fantasy characters. They are based on real peoples and their culture. So it would have been nice if they looked remotely like they lived in the environment. They didn't have SPF 50, I promise you. And then obviously we have the discussion of the Viking ship. Pardon me, I don't speak Norwegian. I believe it's pronounced the Drakenhara Hårfagre, which is the ship that's used in this film. And I don't know why they didn't construct a Pentaconta with the budget they had. I'm sure they had the budget for that. And even if you don't want a Pentaconta and you want something cool looking, you could have gotten away with a trireme, even though they date much later, obviously. They're dated into the 8th century BCE. And to put this into perspective as to how weird this ship looks, the Bronze Age Greece was between circa 3100 to 1050 BCE, and the Vikings were between 793 CE to the mid-11th century, which is around 1066. So being generous by picking the last and the closest dates respectively, that's still a difference of a minimum of 1,842 years between these two types of boats. And to put that into more perspective in terms of how weird that is in the film, there's only 350 years between Shakespeare and the invention of the Nike shoe. And I'm sure everyone would have found it really absurd if in a Shakespeare film like Shakespeare in Love, everyone's kicking about in white trainers. I cannot emphasise that enough. That's a long time. That's 1,842 years between when the Odyssey would have happened and this darn ship was invented. And what's, I think, just baffling about it is it doesn't look remotely Greek. Like, were they just being lazy? Do they think Nordic watercraft looks ancient Greek, or do they think people are too stupid to notice, or that people won't care? Even though I'm sure they would care, because if you made a Norse mythology film and you dressed all the Vikings in Roman togas, people would think it looked odd, because it does. Boats matter too. And also, if we're just shoving a Viking ship in there, why do we just casually mix ancient cultures for our own monetary gain, as if people who cultivated these things are not completely distinctive in both period and culture? I mean, it's sort of very British attitude. I also saw a lot of people complaining about how dark this film looks from the trailer, not just in terms of lighting, but also in saturation. And I sort of rather agree, although it doesn't bother me that much. But I suppose I can see where the shame is. You know, the natural world of the Mediterranean is beautiful, it is vibrant and colourful, and it's sort of a shame not to showcase that. Because one does not have to zap the saturation out of a film to make it look dark and serious and edgy. Lord of the Rings is another great example of that. You know, New Zealand landscape, with all its colour and magnificence and diversity, didn't detract from the gritty, dark nature of the story. In fact, it kind of gave a nice contrast between discussions of good and evil, which is fundamental to the whole franchise. I mean, the foliage and landscape that we see in this trailer does not look Mediterranean at all. Ironically, it does look rather Nordic, and I know a lot of the scenes were shot here in Scotland, and unless they're doing a lot of editing, the natural landscape of Scotland and Greece do not look anything alike. I'm hoping the trailer only shows you those bits, but in reality the rest of the film may showcase the colourful vibrancy, because it's meant to be exciting. That's the whole point. You know, out of the two texts, the Odyssey and the Iliad, the Odyssey, when you're reading it, feels colourful compared to the Iliad. You know, everything is fast-paced, it's an adventure story, it's all new, we travel from place to place, we see these monsters. You know, Odysseus is the man that people tell stories of, he's seen so much, and there's a reason he chooses to carry on travelling afterwards. He's addicted to the journey and to the thrill of it all, and we, as the consumer of his story, are supposed to relate to that by the end of the Odyssey, when he chooses to bugger off again. But if the Odyssey were as bleak and dreary as the trailer suggests, I don't really see the appeal of that. But when you're reading the Odyssey, it feels colourful. Nothing about it feels dark and grey and not that serious. The Iliad has that tone to it. You know, you're reading it and you're like, my god, we're in the same environment. It's sort of monotonous, but in that kind of haunting way. And the Odyssey isn't. It's varied, it's vibrant. So for it to choose a dark, kind of gritty, it may work. But I think, again, you don't have to resort to I don't think it's necessary to take away any of the colour from it to make it serious, like to make it kind of scary. I'm curious. I didn't find, honestly, when I watched the trailer, I went, that felt really boring. Like, there's a scene where he and his men are running down a hill, and it looks so anticlimactic. I'm like, is that meant to be epic? Is that meant to be an epic shot of them running down this hill? Because it kind of looks a bit weak. It's far from any of the charges in the Lord of the Rings films. And it just looked a bit meh. I wanted to see more monsters. I wanted to see more of the Cyclops. I wanted to see more, like, I wanted the edgy monster kind of thing. And yeah, I don't know. I found it really not very exciting. I thought it was a bit boring, the advert. It didn't look aesthetically colourful or exciting or enticing in any way. And then I think, I mean, having that first shot with that armour, I think, is going to knock people sideways. I'm open to seeing what they're doing. Maybe it's something magical. Maybe, I don't know, maybe he's really playing with the story. We only have a trailer. From what I've seen, I'm not hopeful. You know, I would like to have seen at least a trireme. I have to watch The Return, but those are my thoughts of the trailer, honestly. I can go on and on. There will be more trailers, and I'll obviously respond to the film when it comes out. But thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please consider liking and subscribing and sharing it with people. And if you're new, hello, lovely to meet you. I'm now hit 300,000 subscribers. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed and also who joined me on the celebration live stream I did. I really appreciate it. But most importantly, thank you to my Patreons, as always, for seeing me through to this year. It's going to be an intensive year. So as always, if you want me to cover anything particular, there is a Google form box sheet that you can fill in the description box down below. Thank you as always, and I hope you are happy and healthy. And remember, books save lives, so keep reading.